One night with me and your heart will never belong to anyone else. Welcome to the world of science fiction. Comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Victor adjusted the stiff collar of his diplomat uniform, his face betraying none of the annoyance swirling in his chest. Euphoria Station, the most ostentatious galactic pleasure hub in the universe, loomed ahead like a jeweled behemoth. Suspended in the blackness of space from his shuttle window, he could see it glowing, pulsating even with neon lights, and streams of interstellar traffic circling its massive structure. To the untrained eye, it was mesmerizing. To Victor, it was just another complication in his already overbooked diplomatic schedule. Welcome to Euphoria Station. Ambassador chirped the station's automated greeting system as he stepped off the shuttle and onto the grand docking platform. The air was thick with scents of spices, perfumes, and something metallic, perhaps the remnants of an industrial cleaning process. Alien beings of every shape, size, and species swarmed around him, their chatter a chaotic symphony. Victor remained unimpressed. He had been to dozens of stations like this one. The galaxy might be vast, but opulence always followed the same script. Sir, this way. His assistant, a short and efficient human named Marina, directed him toward the diplomatic quarter. They were here for yet another negotiation. This time between two trade factions fighting over mineral rights. It was routine work for Victor, and truthfully, he relished the challenge of navigating galactic politics. What he didn't relish was the socializing expected of him. Afterward, Marina pulled him aside just before they reached their destination. Sir, the station's ambassador insists on hosting you at tonight's gala. It's customary. Victor frowned. Customary or mandatory? Does it matter you're going? Marina replied with a smirk, clearly enjoying her small victory over her usually unshakable boss. Victor sighed, but gave no further protest. A gala meant rubbing elbows with egotistical politicians, eccentric merchants, and overly flirtatious dignitaries. It was exhausting, but part of the job. He just had to survive the evening without causing an interstellar incident. Simple enough. Hours later, Victor found himself standing in the midst of a dazzling ballroom, its ceiling a projection of swirling galaxies and shimmering stardust. The walls were lined with floating platforms where alien performers twisted and spun in gravity-defying dances. Tables groaned under the weight of exotic foods, everything from glowing fruits to dishes that appeared to move of their own accord. The room was a riot of color, sound, and indulgence. Victor nursed a glass of something green and fizzy, his attention only half on the dignitary droning on about mineral tariffs beside him. He had a practiced skill for appearing engaged while his mind wandered. It was a survival tactic in his line of work. And then he saw her. She was impossible to miss, towering above the crowd at an intimidating 12 feet tall. She moved with a grace that bellied her size. Her skin shimmered faintly, a deep teal with golden undertones that caught the light as she walked. Her long flowing hair was the color of liquid silver cascading down her back in waves. But it was her eyes that held Victor's attention, piercing and sharp with a mischievous glint that promised trouble. Victor blinked momentarily, thrown off his usual composure. She was unlike any alien he'd encountered before. Her kind was rare in these parts, and from the whispers and sidelong glances of the other guests, it was clear she commanded attention wherever she went. Ambassador, she said, her voice smooth and rich like honeyed wine. As she stopped directly in front of him, the dignitary beside Victor quickly excused himself. Sensing that this was no casual encounter, Victor tilted his head, regarding her with the measured expression he used on everyone. You seem to have me at a disadvantage. Her lips curved into a knowing smile. Selena, she introduced herself, extending a hand. Victor hesitated before shaking it, her grip firm but not crushing. And you are Victor, Earth's diplomat, here to mediate yet another tedious trade dispute. You've done your homework, Victor replied, raising an eyebrow. But I'm afraid I can't say the same for you. Zelena laughed, a sound that seemed to ripple through the room and draw a few more eyes their way. Oh, you'll know me soon enough. I make an impression. I can see that, Victor said, dry, his diplomatic mask slipping slightly as he allowed a hint of amusement to seep into his tone. And what exactly brings someone like you to a place like this? She leaned and slightly forcing Victor to tilt his head back to maintain eye contact. Perhaps I was waiting for someone like you. Victor fought the urge to roll his eyes. He'd heard every line in the book during his years of diplomacy, and he wasn't about to be charmed by someone simply because they were tall and gorgeous. I'll need something more convincing than that. Zelina's smile widened, and she leaned back, clearly enjoying the exchange. Very well, spend one night with me, and I'll prove it. Victor blinked, caught off guard for the first time in years. I'm sorry, what one night? She repeated, her tone playful but with an edge of challenge. I promise after tonight your heart will never belong to anyone else. Victor laughed, a genuine laugh that startled even him. That's quite the claim. Do you always make such bold promises? Only when I intend to keep them, she said with a wink. Victor shook his head, a small smirk tugging at his lips. I think I'll pass. I have enough complications in my life without adding whatever this is. Zelina tilted her head, her expression unreadable. You're afraid? I'm cautious, Victor corrected, but even as he said it, he realized he was intrigued. There was something about her, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. But I appreciate the offer. She stepped closer, and Victor felt the room grow quieter, as though her presence had somehow dimmed the chaos around them. Caution is admirable, Ambassador, she said softly, but sometimes the greatest rewards come from taking a risk. Victor met her gaze, his usual confidence faltering under the weight of her intensity. He opened his mouth to reply, but before he could, Zelina took his glass from his hand, drained it in one elegant motion, and turned to leave. I'll be waiting, she said over her shoulder, her silver hair glinting as she disappeared into the crowd. Victor stood there frozen for a moment before letting out of breath. He hadn't realized he'd been holding. What the hell just happened? He muttered to himself. Marina appeared at his side, her expression a mix of amusement and exasperation. Sir, I think you just got propositioned by a 12 feet tall alien. Not just propositioned, Victor replied, shaking his head. Challenged. Victor spent the next few hours trying to focus on the diplomatic gala and the steady stream of alien dignitaries seeking his attention, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Zelina. Her challenge played on a loop in his mind, her voice somehow still lingering, as though she were standing next to him. He hated to admit it even to himself, but she had managed to rattle him, and Victor prided himself on being unshakable. By the time the formalities of the evening wound down, Victor was ready to retreat to his quarters. He had successfully mediated a few minor disputes between trade representatives, dodged the advances of a flirtatious Marvian merchant, and avoided scandalous entanglements. A successful evening by most measures. Yet as he made his way back through the sprawling corridors of Euphoria Station, he found himself scanning the crowd for a certain towering figure. Ridiculous, he muttered under his breath. Zelina's words shouldn't have affected him. He wasn't here to entertain the whims of eccentric aliens. He was here to do his job, and yet the intrigue she stirred in him was undeniable. The corridors leading to his quarters were quieter than the grand ballroom, though still alive with the hum of distant music and laughter. Euphoria Station never truly slept. It thrived on indulgence 24 hours a cycle. As Victor turned a corner, a figure stepped out of the shadows ahead, blocking his path. It was Zelina. Victor froze for a moment, his surprise quickly masked by his usual composure. Do you make a habit of lurking in corridors, or am I just special? Her lips curled into that infuriatingly confident smile. Special, of course, but lurking hardly. I was merely waiting. I knew you'd come this way. Let me guess, Victor said dry. You've memorized the station's layout, calculated the most probable path I'd take, and stationed yourself here for maximum effect. Exactly, Zelina replied, her tone teasing. You catch on quickly. Victor sighed. If this is about your earlier proposition, I'm afraid I'm still going to have to decline. Afraid, she repeated, her smile widening. That's twice now you've used that word, Victor. I wonder if it's a Freudian slip. He crossed his arms, refusing to rise to her bait. And what exactly do you think I'm afraid of? Perhaps you're afraid I'm right, she said, stepping closer, even with her keeping a respectful distance. The difference in their height was striking. That one night with me really will change everything. Victor laughed softly, shaking his head. You have a remarkable amount of confidence, and you have a remarkable amount of restraint, She countered, her gaze sharp, but restraint can be a prison. Tell me, Victor, when was the last time you allowed yourself to do something just because you wanted to? Her question caught him off guard. That's irrelevant, is it? She pressed. Or is it exactly the point? Victor opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand, silencing him. I understand you're cautious, I understand. You think you're too busy for distractions, but this isn't just a distraction. It's an opportunity. And I think deep down you know that he frowned. An opportunity for what? For connection. She said simply, for something more meaningful than another diplomatic exchange or another empty conversation. At a gala, Victor studied her, searching for any hint of insincerity, but her expression was earnest, her golden eyes filled with a vulnerability he hadn't expected. Against his better judgment, he felt his resolve begin to crack. I still don't understand. Why me? He said finally. You could have approached anyone at that gala. Why single me out? Because you're different, Selena said, her voice soft. Most people at that gala were exactly what they seemed: self-serving, shallow, predictable. But you're not like them. You're guarded, yes, but beneath that you're curious, you're real. Victor didn't know how to respond to that. No one had ever described him in such a way before. He was used to being seen as the consummate professional, the unflappable diplomat. But real, that was new. Selena took another step closer, and Victor realized he was holding his breath. One night, she said again, her tone gentle now, almost pleading. No strings, no expectations, just one night to see if there's something here worth exploring. Victor hesitated. Every rational part of him screamed to walk away, to retreat to the safety of his quarters and forget this ever happened. But there was another part of him, a quieter, more instinctive part, that whispered something else entirely. It whispered that maybe, just maybe, she was right. What's the worst that could happen? She added, as though reading his mind. Victor sighed. You're relentless. You know that. It's part of my charm, she said, flashing him a grin. Against his better judgment, Victor found himself nodding. Fine. One night. Selena's smile widened, and for the first time, Victor thought he saw genuine joy in her expression. You won't regret this, she said. We'll see, he replied, trying to sound nonchalant. But as she turned and gestured for him to follow, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Selena led him through the winding corridors of Euphoria Station, past vibrant markets and glowing cantinas, until they reached a quieter section of the station. The atmosphere here was different, more intimate, less chaotic. The air was warmer, the lighting softer. Victor felt his tension begin to ease despite himself. They arrived at a small, unassuming door. Selena opened it, revealing a cozy lounge bathed in golden light. The room was filled with plush cushions and low tables, and the walls were adorned with intricate tapestries that seemed to shift and shimmer as Victor looked at them. This is not what I expected, he admitted. Selena chuckled. What did you expect? Something more grandiose, something more obvious, he said. This feels surprisingly personal. It is personal, she said, her tone serious now. If we're going to spend the night together, it should mean something. Victor arched an eyebrow. And what exactly is it supposed to mean? Selena stepped closer, her towering presence somehow comforting rather than intimidating. That's for us to discover, she said softly. No expectations, remember? Victor nodded, though his mind was already racing with questions. He had no idea what the night would bring, but for the first time in years he found himself looking forward to the unknown. Victor wasn't sure what he had expected when he agreed to Selena's challenge, but the intimate setting of the lounge caught him off guard. The low hum of the room's temperature regulators mixed with the faint melodic tones of AL instruments playing softly in the background. Everything about the space was designed to make it easy to let one's guard down, and that made Victor instinctively want to keep his guard up. Selena crossed the room with a fluid grace that seemed to defy her towering stature. She gestured for Victor to take a seat on one of the plush cushions. He hesitated briefly before sitting, his diplomatic instincts warning him to stay alert. She noticed, of course. She seemed to notice everything. You don't trust easily, do you? She asked, as she sat across from him, her movements slow and deliberate, like a predator trying not to startle his prey. Trust is earned, Victor replied, not given freely. Fair enough, she smiled, leaning forward slightly. Even seated, she loomed over him, but there was no malice in her Gay only curiosity. Let's make it easier then. Ask me anything. I have nothing to hide. Victor considered her offer. He wasn't used to people or aliens for that matter being so forthright. Most of the individuals he dealt with as a diplomat had layers of motives all wrapped in half-truths and careful deceptions, but Selena seemed different. At least he wanted to believe she was all right. He said, folding his hands in his lap, "Why me? And don't just tell me it's because I'm different. I want the real reason." Selena tilted her head, her silver hair catching the golden light for a moment. She seemed to weigh her words carefully. "The truth is, I'm curious about you. Humans are fascinating to my people, but you in particular caught my attention. You carry yourself with such control, such precision, but underneath it all there's something else, something restless." Victor raised an eyebrow. "Restless? Yes," she said, with a small smile. "You've spent so much of your life being what others need you to be, a diplomat, a mediator, a voice of reason. But what about what you need? Have you ever asked yourself that?" Victor frowned, caught off guard by her observation. He opened his mouth to respond, but found he didn't have an immediate answer. Instead, he deflected. "That's a lot to infer from one conversation." "It's not just the conversation," Selena replied, her voice soft. "It's the way you hold yourself, the way you deflect questions with humor or vague answers. You're good at keeping people at arm's length, Victor. But I wonder what would happen if someone got close." Victor leaned back, studying her. "You're remarkably perceptive. It's a skill," she said with a wink, "one that served me well. Is that why you approached me, to dissect my psyche?" Selena laughed, a rich melodic sound that filled the room. "Not at all. I approached you because I saw someone worth knowing, and yes, maybe I thought I could learn something from you along the way." Victor hesitated, unsure how to respond. He wasn't used to being the center of someone else's curiosity. Most people approached him because of his title, his influence, or what he could do for them. But Selena seemed genuinely interested in him. It was unsettling, but not entirely unwelcome. "All right," he said. "Finally, your turn. Why are you here on Euphoria Station?" "I mean," Selena's smile faded, slightly replaced by a more thoughtful expression. "I'm here because I needed to get away from my home world. My people, Thalvin, are complicated." Victor leaned forward, intrigued. "Complicated?" How she hesitated, her golden eyes flickering with a hint of vulnerability. "We're a proud race, too proud perhaps. We value beauty, strength, and charm above all else. But those values come with expectations that I'd never quite fit." Victor frowned. "You don't seem like the type to care much about fitting expectations." "I don't," she admitted, "not anymore. But it took me a long time to get to this point. And even now there are times when it feels like I'm still fighting to prove myself." "To who?" Selena paused, her gaze dropping to her hands. "To everyone. My family, my people, myself." Victor studied her, surprised by the vulnerability in her voice. He had assumed she was all confidence and charm, but there was more to her than he had realized. For the first time that night he felt a pang of empathy for her. He knew what it was like to feel the weight of expectations. "What about you?" she asked, suddenly looking up at him. "What brought you here, really?" Victor hesitated, caught off guard by the question. "I'm here for work diplomacy." "I know that," she said, rolling her eyes playfully. "But that's not what I asked. I mean, why do you do what you do? What drives you?" Victor opened his mouth to reply, but found himself at a loss for words. It was a question he had never really stopped to consider. He had always been so focused on his duties, his responsibilities, that he hadn't given much thought to his own motivations. "I suppose I've always wanted to make a difference," he said finally, "to bring people together, to resolve conflicts rather than create them." "That's noble," Selena said softly. "But is it enough?" Victor frowned. "What do you mean?" "I mean, is it enough for you?" she asked, her gaze piercing. "Or are you just doing what you think you're supposed to do?" Victor didn't answer. He couldn't. Her question hit too close to home, stirring thoughts and doubts he had long buried. Selena seemed to sense his discomfort and leaned back, giving him space. "I'm sorry if that was too personal." "It's fine," Victor said quickly, though his tone betrayed his unease. I'm not used to this being the one under the microscope," he admitted. "I'm usually the one asking the questions." "Well," Selena said with a small smile, "maybe it's time for a change." Victor chuckled despite himself. "You're relentless. I told you it's part of my charm." They sat in silence for a moment. the tension between them easing. Victor found himself relaxing, his defenses lowering in a way he hadn't expected. Selena had a way of drawing him out, of making him confront parts of himself he usually kept hidden. It was unsettling, but also strangely freeing. As the night wore on, Victor realized that Selena was more than just a flirtatious alien with a knack for persuasion. She was intelligent, insightful, and above all real. And for the first time in a long time, Victor felt like he was having a conversation that mattered. Maybe, just maybe, Selena had been right. Maybe one night really could change everything. Victor awoke the next morning to the faint hum of Euphoria Station's engine reverberating through the walls of his guest quarters. He blinked at the unfamiliar ceiling, golden lights streaming in from hidden panels, and briefly wondered if last night had been some bizarre dream. But the faint scent of Selena's perfume still lingered on his jacket, draped over a chair nearby, a tangible reminder that it had all been very real. He hadn't expected to spend so much of the night talking to her. After their initial banter in the lounge, the conversation had taken unexpected turns, diving into everything from interstellar politics to the finer points of Thalvan cuisine. She had laughed at his dry humor, teased him mercilessly about his overly formal demeanor, and for reasons Victor still couldn't fully comprehend, shared pieces of herself that felt deeply personal. As much as Victor hated to admit it, she had been right about one thing: he was restless. There was something about Selena that stirred a part of him he thought he had buried under years of diplomatic decorum and carefully crafted neutrality, and that scared him more than he cared to admit. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts, signaling an incoming message. He sat up, brushing a hand through his hair, and tapped the console on the bedside table. Marina's face appeared on the screen, her expression as sharp and efficient as ever. "Good morning, sir," she said briskly. "I hope you're ready. The trade negotiations start in an hour." Victor sighed. "Of course, I'll be there." Marina hesitated, her gaze flickering briefly, as if debating whether to say something. "You seem distracted this morning." "I'm fine," he said, quickly brushing off her concern. "Just a long night." Her eyebrow arched slightly, but she didn't press the issue very well. "I'll see you in the conference chamber." The screen went dark, leaving Victor alone with his thoughts. Once more he stood stretched and moved to the small sink to splash water on his face. As he caught his reflection in the mirror, he frowned. Was it just his imagination? Or did he look different? He shook his head. Ridiculous. He had a job to do, and he couldn't afford to let one night of unexpected conversation throw him off his game. The trade negotiations were as tedious as Victor had anticipated. Representatives from two rival factions, a mining conglomerate and a merchant guild, squabbled over mineral rights to a small but resourcer asteroid belt in the sector. Both sides presented their cases with excessive theatrics, their voices rising and falling in exaggerated waves. Victor maintained his usual calm, mediating the discussion with practiced ease, but his mind kept drifting back to Selena. He wondered what she was doing. Was she still on the station? Would he see her again? He had no reason to believe their paths would cross a second time. Last night had been a fluke, a chance encounter, and yet a part of him hoped otherwise. "Ambassador, your thoughts?" one of the merchants prompted, snapping Victor back to the present. He cleared his throat, quickly formulating a response. "I believe both sides have valid points, but perhaps a temporary shared jurisdiction agreement would allow for a trial period to determine." Before he could finish, the doors to the chamber burst open with a loud hiss, drawing everyone's attention. Victor turned, his heart skipping a beat as Selena strode into the room. She was impossible to ignore, her tall frame and commanding presence instantly dominating the space. The dignitaries fell silent, their earlier arguments forgotten as they gawked at her. Victor resisted the urge to groan. Whatever she was doing here, it couldn't be good for his already tenuous hold on the negotiations. "Apologies for the interruption," Selena said smoothly, her voice carrying a note of authority that silenced any objections before they could be voiced. "But I believe this discussion requires a broader perspective." Victor rose from his seat, his diplomatic mask firmly in place. "Selena, this is a closed session. If you have concerns, my concerns are the galaxy's concerns." "Ambassador," she interrupted, her golden eyes locking onto his. There was a spark of mischief there. but also something more serious, and I believe you'll find my perspective quite enlightening. The mining representative, a burly alien with dark-rigged skin, crossed his arms. Who is this, and why should we care about her perspective? Zelena turned to him with a smile that was equal parts charming and dangerous. I am Zelena of Thalia, envoy of my people, and a representative of interests that extend far beyond this little dispute. If you think you can dismiss me, I suggest you reconsider. Victor pinched the bridge of his nose, trying to suppress the headache building behind his temples. Zelena, perhaps we could discuss this in private. I'm afraid time is of the essence, she said, cutting him off again. Ambassador, you said last night that diplomacy is about bringing people together. Consider this my attempt to do just that. The merchant representative, a wiry alien with a sharp beak-like face, tilted his head curiously. And what exactly does Thalia have to do with our dispute? More than you realize, Selena replied. She stepped forward, addressing the room with the confidence of someone who had been born to command the asteroid belt. You're fighting over isn't just rich in minerals. It contains trace elements of a rare compound my people call Zeum. It's a critical component in our technology, and one we are willing to pay handsomely for. The room erupted into murmurs, the representatives quickly recalculating their positions in light of this new information. Victor, however, was less impressed. He narrowed his eyes at Selena, his tone low and measured as he spoke. You withheld this information until now. Why? She met his gaze unflinching. Because I wasn't sure if I could trust you. The words stung more than Victor cared to admit. And now, she said with a faint smile, I've decided to take a chance. Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. This was rapidly spiraling out of control. He had worked hard to establish a neutral, level playing field for these negotiations, and Zelena's sudden intervention threatened to upend all of it. But as much as he wanted to be angry, he couldn't deny that her presence had shifted the dynamic in a way that might ultimately prove beneficial. The representatives were listening, their earlier hostility tempered by curiosity and a desire to capitalize on this unexpected development. He turned back to the room, his voice steady as he addressed the group. Very well. If Thalia has an interest in these resources, then we must consider their input. But let me make one thing clear. This does not change the terms of this negotiation. We will find a solution that benefits all parties involved, or we will find no solution at all. The room fell silent, the representatives exchanging wary glances before nodding in reluctant agreement. Victor turned back to Selena, his expression unreadable. You've made your point. Now let me do my job. Selena's smile widened, and for a brief moment, Victor thought he saw a flicker of admiration in her gaze. As you wish, Ambassador. By the time the session concluded, Victor felt as though he'd aged 10 years. Selena's sudden involvement had complicated an already delicate situation, but to his frustration and grudging admiration, she had managed to steer the negotiations toward a compromise. Her revelation about the asteroid Zeum deposits had shifted the power dynamic in the room, forcing both factions to consider Thalia's interest in the dispute for all her theatrics. She had been right. Her presence had broadened the conversation. Still, Victor wasn't about to let her off the hook so easily. He waited until the last of the representatives had left the chamber, their voices fading into the background as they made their way down the long corridors of Euphoria Station. Zelena lingered, leaning casually against the edge of the conference table, as though she hadn't just thrown a diplomatic hand grenade into the middle of his carefully orchestrated negotiations. Victor approached her, his hands clasped behind his back, and his expression unreadable. You have a habit of making things more difficult than they need to be. Selena looked up at him, her golden eyes sparkling with amusement. Difficult? I'd argue I made things more interesting. Interesting wasn't what I was going for, he replied evenly. I was going for productive. And yet, she said, straightening to her full towering height, we achieved a compromise that wouldn't have been possible without my intervention. You're welcome, by the way. Victor sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. You could have told me about Thalia's interest in the asteroid belt before the negotiations started. I could have, she agreed, folding her arms. But would you have listened, or would you have dismissed me as just another self-serving opportunist? Victor frowned. I don't dismiss people lightly, don't you? She challenged, her tone softer now. I've seen the way you operate, Victor. You rely on logic and control because it's safe. It keeps things predictable, but diplomacy isn't just about logic, it's about instinct too. Sometimes you have to take a leap of faith. Victor met her gaze, his jaw tightening. He hated to admit it, but there was a kernel of truth in her words. He had always prided himself on his ability to remain detached, to weigh every decision with cold, calculated precision. But Selena's approach, reckless, emotional, and deeply personal, had achieved results he couldn't deny. "You don't play by the rules," he said finally. "I play by my own rules," she corrected, her lips curving into a faint smile. "And I think you're starting to realize that's not always a bad thing." Victor didn't respond, his thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. She was infuriating, unpredictable, and far too perceptive for his comfort. But she was also brilliant, compassionate, and he hated to admit it, remarkably effective. As if sensing his inner turmoil, Selena took a step closer, her presence both imposing and oddly reassuring. "I know I threw you off balance today," she said softly, "but I meant what I said last night. I see something in you, Victor, something worth taking a chance on." Victor's breath caught her words, stirring something deep within him. For a moment he allowed himself to entertain the possibility that she might be right, that there was more to life than duty and control, and that maybe, just maybe, he could let someone in. But the moment passed quickly, and he forced himself to step back, putting a careful distance between them. "You're a force of nature, Selena, I'll give you that, but I'm not sure I'm ready for whatever this is." She tilted her head, studying him with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. "You're afraid again." "I'm cautious," he corrected. "Same thing," she said with a wink, "but I'll let you have your space, Ambassador, for now." With that, she turned and walked toward the exit, her silver hair catching the light as she moved. Victor watched her go, his chest tightening with an emotion he couldn't quite name. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, an enigma wrapped in charm and chaos, and he wasn't sure if she was the best thing that had ever happened to him, or the worst. The next few days passed in a blur of meetings, negotiations, and carefully worded communique. Victor threw himself into his work, hoping the familiar routines would drown out the thoughts of Selena that continued to intrude on his mind. But no matter how busy he kept himself, he couldn't shake the memory of her voice, her smile, her unyielding confidence. Marina, ever perceptive, noticed the change in him. "You've been distracted lately," she remarked one evening as they reviewed a draft agreement in his quarters. "I've been busy," Victor replied curtly. "Busy and distracted aren't the same thing," she said, arching an eyebrow. "Is this about the Thalvan envoy?" Victor froze, his pen hovering over the document in front of him. "What about her?" Marina shrugged, her expression carefully neutral. "She seems interested in you. She's interested in advancing her people's agenda," Victor said quickly. "Nothing more," Marina said, clearly unconvinced. "If you say so." Victor didn't respond, focusing instead on the document in front of him. But Marina's words lingered, fueling the doubts that had been quietly gnawing at him since Selena's departure from the negotiation chamber. It wasn't until the end of the week that Victor saw her again. He had just finished a late-night meeting and was making his way back to his quarters when he spotted her in one of the station's observation lounges. She was alone, standing by the massive window that offered a breathtaking view of the stars beyond. Her posture was uncharacteristically still, her usual energy replaced by a quiet solemnity. Victor hesitated, torn between the urge to approach her and the instinct to retreat, but something about the way she stood, so tall and confident yet undeniably vulnerable, drew him forward. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his voice breaking the silence. Selena turned, her expression softening when she saw him. "Something like that." Victor joined her by the window, the two of them standing side by side, as they gazed out at the infinite expanse of space. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence stretching between them like a fragile thread. "You were right," Victor said finally, his voice low, about instinct, about taking risks. Selena glanced at him, her golden eyes searching his face. And I don't know what to do with that," he admitted, his tone uncharacteristically vulnerable. "It's new," she smiled faintly. "New isn't always bad, Victor. Sometimes it's exactly what we need." Victor turned to look at her, his chest tightening as he took in the sincerity in her expression. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that she might be right, that maybe, just maybe, he could take a chance. Before he could talk himself out of it, he spoke the words that had been on the tip of his tongue. Since the night they met, what if I said I'm ready to take that chance? Selena's smile widened, her eyes sparkling with something that looked a lot like hope. Then I'd say it's about time. Victor wasn't sure what had possessed him to say those words, but the moment they left his mouth there was no taking them back. Selena's golden eyes widened slightly, her expression a mix of surprise and amusement, as if she hadn't expected him to admit what they both already knew she had gotten under his skin. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of his confession lingering in the air. Beyond the observation window, stars shimmered like tiny diamonds against the black void of space, their light faint but unyielding. It reminded Victor of how he felt standing next to Selena, small yet inexplicably drawn to her brilliance. Well, she said finally, a playful lilt to her voice, I didn't think you'd actually admit it. I was beginning to think I'd have to drag it out of you. Victor shook his head, a faint smile tugging at his lips. You don't give yourself enough credit. Subtlety isn't exactly your strong suit. Subtlety is overrated, she quipped, leaning one elbow casually on the railing by the window. Her towering frame made the gesture look almost regal. So what does this mean, Ambassador? Are you finally ready to stop running? Victor sighed, running a hand through his hair. I'm not running, I'm cautious. There's that word again, Selena teased, her voice softening. You know, it's okay to let your guard down once in a while. The universe won't fall apart if you stop holding it up for a moment. Victor chuckled, though the sound was tinged with self-deprecation. You make it sound so simple. It can be, she said, her tone serious now, if you let it. Victor met her gaze, the intensity of her golden eyes disarming him in a way that no political adversary ever had. She was right, of course. She always seemed to be right when it came to these things, and as much as he hated to admit it, he was tired of always being the rational one, the one who kept his emotions in check for the sake of appearances. Before he could second-guess himself, he spoke again. You said I should take a chance. What if I'm ready to take that chance with you for a fleeting moment? Selena's confident exterior faltered, her lips parted slightly, and her eyes softened as though she hadn't expected him to say it outright. Then her smile returned, this time gentler, more genuine. I think that would be a very wise decision. Victor exhaled a tension he hadn't realized he was holding easing from his chest. I'm still not entirely sure what I'm getting myself into. Neither am I, she admitted with a shrug, but that's part of the fun, isn't it? Victor couldn't help but laugh at her unshakable optimism. You really do have a way of turning everything into an adventure. It's a gift, she said with a wink. And besides, you could use a little adventure in your life. Admitted you're intriguing, he said honestly, surprising himself with the admission. More than I'd like to admit. Good, she said simply, her smile widening. Then let's see where this goes. The next few days passed in a blur of stolen moments and quiet conversations. Victor and Selena found themselves drawn to each other in ways neither of them fully understood. Their connection was magnetic, undeniable, and unlike anything Victor had ever experienced. For the first time in years, he felt like he wasn't just existing, he was living. Of course, their budding relationship didn't go unnoticed. Marina, ever the professional, had the good sense not to comment directly, but Victor could tell she was watching him with a mixture of curiosity and concern. The station's other diplomats, however, were less subtle. Ambassador, one of them remarked during a meeting, I hear you've been spending quite a bit of time with the Thalvan envoy. Should we be concerned? Victor's response was measured, his tone neutral. Selena has proven to be an insightful and valuable participant in these negotiations. Her perspective has been instrumental in finding a resolution. The diplomat raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Victor knew the rumors would spread regardless of what he said. It was a small price to pay, and for once he didn't particularly care. One evening, Selena invited Victor to a part of Euphoria Station he hadn't explored before, a sprawling open-air garden located near the station's core. The space was filled with bioluminescent plants from dozens of planets, their vibrant colors glowing softly in the artificial twilight. The air was warm and fragrant, carrying the faint scent of alien blossoms. This is incredible, Victor said, his voice filled with genuine awe. As they walked through the garden, I had no idea this was here. It's one of the station's best-kept secrets, Selena replied, her tone proud. I thought you could use a break from all the diplomatic chaos." Victor glanced at her, his expression softening. "You're full of surprises, you have no idea," she said with a mischievous grin. They continued walking the garden's winding paths, leading them to a small clearing, with a bench overlooking the shimmering pool. Selena sat first, her long legs folding gracefully beneath her, and gestured for Victor to join her. He hesitated for only a moment before sitting beside her, their shoulders almost touching for a while. They sat in companionable silence, the soft glow of the garden casting an ethereal light around them. Victor found himself relaxing in a way he hadn't in years, the weight of his responsibilities temporarily forgotten. "Do you ever wonder," Selena said suddenly, her voice quiet, "what it would be like to just leave it all behind?" Victor turned to her, surprised by the question. "Leave what behind?" "All of it," she said, gesturing vaguely. "The politics, the expectations, the constant pressure to be something for everyone else. Don't you ever think about just walking away?" Victor frowned, considering her words. "I've thought about it," he admitted, "but it's not that simple. My work matters. It makes a difference, of course." "It does," Selena said, her tone gentle. "But what about what matters to you? What do you want?" Victor, the question hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. Victor had spent so much of his life focused on what others needed from him that he hadn't given much thought to his own desires. But as he sat there beside Selena, he realized that for the first time he might have an answer. "I want this," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I want you." Selena turned to him, her golden eyes searching his face for a long moment. Then she smiled, a warm, radiant smile that seemed to light up the entire garden. "You have me," she said softly, "for as long as you'll let me stay." Victor's chest tightened, a mix of emotions swirling within him, hope, fear, excitement, and something that felt an awful lot like happiness. He reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers, and for once he allowed himself to simply feel as the garden around them glowed with the soft light of 100 alien plants. Victor realized that Selena had been right all along. Sometimes the greatest rewards came from taking a chance. Victor awoke with a strange sense of calm, the kind he hadn't felt in years. The memory of the previous evening still lingered in his mind, Selena's warm smile, the glow of the bioluminescent garden, and the way her presence seemed to make the chaos of his life fade into the background for the first time in what felt like forever. He wasn't thinking about the next negotiation, the next meeting, or the next crisis. Instead, he was thinking about her as he prepared for the day ahead. Victor found himself wondering what Selena was doing. The thought made him pause. He had always been disciplined, focused, and in control. But Selena had a way of breaking through all of that, making him feel things he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. It was both exhilarating and terrifying. A chime interrupted his thoughts, signaling an incoming message. He tapped the console on his desk, and Marina's face appeared on the screen. Her expression was uncharacteristically tense. "Sir, we have situation," she said without preamble. Victor straightened, his calm quickly replaced by the familiar sense of urgency. "What is it?" "One of the mining faction ships was attacked near the asteroid belt," Marina explained. "They're blaming the Theans." Victor's stomach sank. "Do they have evidence?" "Not yet," she admitted, "but the timing is suspicious and tensions are already high. They're demanding an emergency meeting." Victor nodded, his mind racing. "Set it up. I'll be there." As the screen went dark, Victor couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't a coincidence. The delicate balance he had worked so hard to maintain was unraveling, and he couldn't help but wonder if Selena was somehow involved. The emergency meeting was tense from the moment it began. Representatives from the mining and merchant factions filled the room, their voices raised in anger as they hurled accusations at one another. Victor sat at the head of the table, his expression calm, but his mind racing as he worked to piece together the situation. "We have reason to believe the Theans are behind this attack," the mining representative said, his tone sharp. "They've made no secret of their interest in the asteroid belt, and this is clearly an attempt to intimidate us." "That's absurd," the merchant representative countered. "The Theans have been nothing but cooperative. You're using this as an excuse to escalate the conflict." Victor raised a hand, silencing the room. "Enough," he said firmly. "We don't have enough information to draw conclusions. Until we do, speculation will only make things worse." The room fell Silent though the tension remained palpable, Victor turned his attention to Marina, who was seated beside him. What do we know about the attack? Not much, she admitted. The ship was transporting raw materials from one of the smaller asteroids. When it was ambushed, the attackers were heavily armed and used advanced cloaking technology. Victor